Have you ever imagined being born into a life where your future wasn't T-shaped by your choices, your ambition, or your dreams, but by a centuries-old genetic curse that your ancestors created in the desperate pursuit of power? Young people today fear unemployment, anxiety, loneliness, and an uncertain future. But Maria Antonia of Austria entered a world where the biggest threat to her survival wasn't the outside world, it was her own blood. She was the final product of a dynasty that believed power was safest when trapped inside their own family tree. A dynasty that married cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, and sometimes even closer, until each new royal birth was less like the arrival of a child and more like the flipping of a coin between life and disaster. Maria Antonia's story doesn't begin with her birth, it begins centuries earlier, when the Habsburg family decided that keeping their blood pure was more important than anything else, and so they kept tightening the genetic noose around themselves with every generation. Her mother, Margaret Teresa of Spain, was already a fragile product of this system, sickly, weak, often bedridden, and dead at only 21, worn down by pregnancies, and a body that could no longer fight the consequences of centuries of inbreeding. Her uncle, King Charles II of Spain, was the world's most famous victim of dynastic obsession, able to walk properly, unable to speak clearly, unable to rule on his own, and so physically and mentally broken that Europe whispered he had been cursed at birth. And in the middle of this collapsing dynasty, with kingdoms on the edge of chaos and bloodlines on the edge of extinction, Maria Antonia arrived not as a blessing, but as the last gamble of a dying empire. She entered the world in 1669 at the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, a miracle child in the eyes of the Europeans who secretly wondered how someone with such a dangerously high inbreeding coefficient could survive past infancy. Most Habsburg children born at this point died within hours or days. Maria had already lost 3 siblings before she was even old enough to walk. From the moment she opened her eyes, diplomats studied her like a living experiment, watching her every movement, every expression, waiting to see whether she would show the same deformities, the same weaknesses, the same curse that was eating her dynasty alive. While normal children played, Maria was paraded in Port Spain again and again, shipped off across Europe like a political advertisement to convince foreign courts that she was strong, healthy, and capable of one day inheriting the Spanish throne. She had barely learned to speak when her father, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, began using her as a weapon in Europe. His biggest political chess match, the struggle for control of Spain, an empire so vast that its territories stretched across continents. But there was a problem: Spain was terrified of female rulers. For centuries, they believed only a male could control the empire. Yet Charles II, the bewitched king, couldn't produce an heir, and the only viable successor was this quiet, serious child with the most inbred blood in European history. The pressure on her was unimaginable. Every diplomat who visited Vienna inspected her like a prize horse. How straight were her teeth? How steady was her walk? How bright were her eyes? Did she look strong enough to carry a future heir? Could she break the curse, or was she simply another tragedy waiting to happen? And even as a child, she carried the burden of Europe's expectations. Meanwhile, her father remarried again and again, producing new half-siblings almost every year. Each birth pushing Maria further away from Austria's inheritance and deeper into Spain's crisis. She grew up in a palace full of sickly babies, fragile heirs, uneasy marriages, and political storms. She watched as physicians, midwives, and priests rushed through halls at night, trying desperately to keep newborns alive while the empire prayed for a male. She saw her stepmother, Claudia Felicitas Stayón, just like her own mother. She saw her family mourn children who never lived long enough to be named. And quietly, she began to understand that the Habsburg blood, the blood she carried, was slowly killing them all. But Europe didn't care about her fears or her childhood. They only cared about her womb. They wanted to know whether this girl, born from one of the most genetically damaged families in history, could create a child strong enough to rule an empire. When she was just 6 years old, Emperor Leopold made a shocking move. He proposed that Maria Antonia should marry her own uncle, Charles II of Spain. Even by Habsburg standards, this was extreme. Charles was deformed, mentally impaired, and physically decaying, his jaw so misaligned he couldn't eat properly. His body so weak he could barely walk. His reproductive system so damaged that doctors openly doubted he could ever father a child. But Spain was desperate for an heir, and Austria was desperate to control Spain. So they tried to force a 6-year-old and a 13-year-old uncle into one of the most disturbing royal engagements in history. This wasn't love, or marriage, or familyette. It was politics weaponizing bloodlines. And for a moment, Europe thought the match would go through. A proxy wedding was even drafted, but at the last moment, Charles II backed out. He said Maria was too young, too fragile, too small. In reality, everyone knew the truth. Even his own physicians warned the Spanish court that Charles was incapable of fathering children. A child bride wouldn't save the dynasty, so Maria Antonia's engagement collapsed, and with it, collapsed Austria's first plan to control the Spanish throne. But her nightmare was far from over. If she couldn't marry her uncle, she would be married to someone else. Someone powerful. Someone politically convenient. She had no choice. She had no voice. She had no future except the one chosen for her. And as she entered her teenage years, the walls of the palace began to whisper one truth: Maria Antonia, the most inbred princess in history, was running out of time. The teenage years of Maria Antonia of Austria were a labyrinth of politics, power, and the inescapable curse of her blood years, where every smile, every gesture, every breath she took was measured, analyzed, and politicized by an entire continent desperate to control the fate of Spain. Before the fragile body of her uncle Charles II finally gave out, her childhood innocence had long since been stripped away, replaced by a cold understanding that her value was not in who she was, but in what she could produce in the womb she carried, in the fragile hope of a male heir who could prevent Europe from plunging into war. And yet, despite the immense genetic weight that dragged at her every step, Maria Antonia remained miraculously resilient, her body surviving where others had failed, her mind sharp where others were broken, a living testament to the cruel paradox of her dynasty, that even in the face of centuries of inbreeding and disease, life sometimes found a way to cling stubbornly to the next generation. While other Habsburg children died in their cradles, while her mother had succumbed at 21 to complications of pregnancy and disease, Maria Antonia thrived in her youth, developing a quiet intelligence and seriousness beyond her years. A reflection, not of privilege, but of necessity, for every moment of play and laughter was tempered by the constant awareness that her entire life had been charted by her father Leopold I, and by the intricate web of European diplomacy where nations, empires, and monarchs were all watching the young girl in Vienna, scrutinizing her posture, her health, her ability to endure, to see whether the curse of the Habsburgs would claim yet another life, or whether she might by some miracle survive to become the pawn and weapon in a political game centuries in the making. As she grew older, Leopold began carefully orchestrating the next phase of her life, seeking to secure her future not through affection or compatibility, but through the cold arithmetic of dynastic survival. And so, in 1685, at the age of 16, Maria Antonia was married to her second cousin, Maximilian II, Prince Elector of Bavaria. A union designed not for love, but for political convenience, for Austria needed an ally in Bavaria. For Spain's succession hung precariously on the edge of Europe's balance, and Maria Antonia, the most inbred princess of all time, was now the bridge between kingdoms, the living vessel through which history would be decided. Yet the marriage, while politically astute, was personally devastating for Maria. Antonia found herself wed to a man whose temperament, intellect, and desires were entirely at odds with her own, a man who was extroverted, carefree, and morally ambiguous, while she was serious, studious, and intensely aware of the stakes that had been thrust upon her. A man who openly flaunted his infidelity, parading mistruths in front of his wife, a deliberate, cruel display of power and dominance, leaving Maria isolated, humiliated, and trapped in a gilded cage where escape was impossible. And yet, despite the personal anguish, her biological mission remained, for she was expected to produce heirs, particularly male heirs who could secure the Habsburg claim to Spain, a responsibility that weighed heavier than any courtly insult or emotional injury. The years that followed were marked by repeated pregnancies, heartbreak, and bodily suffering for Maria Antonia. Despite her relatively healthy childhood, could not escape the curse that haunted her lineage, and like her mother and uncle before her, she endured complications, losing 2 sons. Shortly after birth, tragedies that left her physically weakened, emotionally scarred, and yet politically indispensable for Europe continued. To watch, to hope to calculate whether she might deliver the child who could finally end the uncertainty surrounding the Spanish succession. In October of 1692, against all odds, and through unrelenting personal suffering, Maria Antonia gave birth to a healthy boy, Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, a child who became the living embodiment of Europe's fragile hope, a potential savior of the Habsburg claim to Spain, a boy who carried not just the weight of his family's ambitions, but the collective obsession of every court in Europe. For his survival meant the difference between war and peace, between the continuation of Austria's influence over Spain and the triumph of the rival French Bourbons. And yet the miracle of his birth came at the ultimate cost. For Maria Antonia, exhausted, infected, and weakened by the cumulative effect of generations of genetic damage, succumbed to a postpartum infection that, in today's world, might have been easily treated with antibiotics, but in the late 17th century, was invariably fatal. And so on Christmas Eve of 1692, at the tender age of 23, Maria Antonia of Austria drew her final breath, leaving behind not only her infant son, but also a continent teetering on the brink of succession, crisis, and war. And Europe responded with both awe and despair, mourning the loss of a young princess whose body had been a battlefield of history, genetics, and politics, while simultaneously preparing to exploit the vacuum left by her death for Joseph Ferdinand. Despite surviving infancy was now the sole hope of one of the most ambitious dynastic strategies in history, and the pressure placed upon this child would soon reshape alliances, ignite rivalries, and ultimately influence the fate of nations far beyond Vienna, Munich, or Madrid. As Joseph Ferdinand grew, the eyes of Europe followed every breath, every word, every step, for he carried the blood of the Habsburgs, a bloodline both venerated and cursed. Bloodline that had created monarchs, empires, and wars, but also deformed kings, sickly children, and a legacy of tragedy that seemed destined to repeat itself with horrifying consistency. And though Maria Antonia had perished, her genetic legacy and political influence persisted in Joseph Ferdinand, who became the most closely watched child in Europe. The symbol of a dynastic gamble that had survived against staggering odds. A child who might finally unite claims, stabilize kingdoms, and secured the Austrian Habsburg ambition over the Spanish crown. Yet fate, cruel as ever, would intervene again. For the boy's survival was fleeting, and in 1699, Joseph Ferdinand, the fragile hope of Spain and Austria, succumbed to smallpox, a merciless reminder that even the most carefully orchestrated dynastic strategies could be undone by the smallest of biological forces, leaving Europe in shock, leaving the Habsburgs bereft of their primary claim, and plunging the continent into a renewed and volatile scramble for succession. For with Joseph Ferdinand dead, the Austrians were forced to consider younger alternatives, including Leopold's own sons from his third marriage. Yet the shadow of Maria Antonia's inbreeding, her untimely death, and the ongoing fragility of the Habsburg line loomed over every political negotiation, every courtly maneuver, every diplomatic communication, as rulers calculated alliances and plotted wars based on bloodlines, mortality rates, and the unpredictable hand of fate. The period between Maria Antonia's death and the passing of Charles II in 1700 was a tense and feverish prelude to conflict, a time when every European power from France to England to the Dutch Republic weighed claims, forged treaties, and prepared armies, while the lessons of the Habsburg, inbreeding physical weakness, reproductive fragility, and unpredictable mortality, were not lost on anyone, serving as both a cautionary tale and a reminder that dynastic obsession could create monumental empires, but also profound human tragedy. And that one woman, born into the most inbred and politically significant family of her era, could influence the course of European history even long after her death. For Maria Antonia's life and demise exemplified the intersection of human genetics, political ambition, and the brutal realities of monarchy in the early modern period. A reminder that history is written not only by the victors, but by those who endure the curses of their bloodlines, the relentless weight of expectation, and the merciless scrutiny of a world that saw them less as people and more as instruments of power, survival, and empire. Maria Antonia's death did not mark the end of the dynastic drama. Rather, it threw Europe into a storm of intrigue, fear, and war. For, with her son Joseph Ferdinand gone, the Austrian Habsburg claim to Spain was shattered, and the continent's great powers immediately turned their attention to alternative heirs, calculating every family tree, every marriage, and every potential claim as if they were pieces on a chessboard, knowing that the next few years would determine the fate of empires and colonies across the world. And as Charles II's fragile health continued to deteriorate, the tension in every court from Vienna to Madrid to Versailles was palpable, each diplomat aware that the end of the Spanish Habsburg line was imminent. A scenario that had been predicted for decades, yet never seemed more urgent than in the final years of the 17th century, when Europe's kings, princes, and advisors recognized that centuries of inbreeding, dynastic obsession, and political calculation had led to a moment of catastrophic consequence, where a single death or birth could alter the trajectory of history. And so the death of Maria Antonia became both a personal tragedy and a geopolitical earthquake, her life and suffering now seen as a prelude to the seismic events that would follow. For her own survival might have prevented the chaos that engulfed the continent in the War of the Spanish Succession. Yet the cruel twist of fate ensured that her bloodline, though remarkable for its resilience, could not avert the storm, leaving Charles II childless, sickly, and isolated. A king whose body betrayed his crown, a monarch whose inability to produce an heir triggered a succession crisis that Europe had long feared. And as his health worsened year by year, the Austrian Habsburgs attempted to advance alternative claims through Leopold's other children. Yet the legitimacy and recognition of these claims were tenuous, complicated by politics, by French ambition, and by centuries of dynastic rivalry that stretched across the continent. And when Charles II finally died on November 1st, 1700, the moment was both expected and catastrophic. For he named the French Bourbon candidate Philip of Anjou as his heir, a decision that instantly ignited outrage among Austria, England, the Dutch Republic, and other powers, each fearing the union of France and Spain under a single monarch would upset the fragile balance of Europe. And thus began the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal 13-year struggle drawing in nearly every major European power. A war whose roots traced back not only to the ambitions of kings and dynasties, but to the genetic tragedies of the Habsburg family, to the frailty of its heirs, and to the untimely death of a young woman whose life had been consumed by politics before she even reached adulthood. Irony was bitter. Maria Antonia, who had endured inbreeding, loss, betrayal, and exile, whose own life had been measured in pregnancies and political potential, had failed to live long enough to see her son secure a stable claim, leaving Europe to descend into chaos. A testament to how dynastic obsession and the relentless pursuit of heirs could shape wars, borders, and empires for generations. Throughout the war, Europe witnessed shifting alliances, brutal campaigns, and devastating consequences for ordinary people whose lives were drawn into the grand strategies of While in Vienna and Munich, the Habsburgs mourned not only Maria Antonia, but the potential of her line, understanding that her absence had irreversibly altered their prospects. And though they eventually gained territories like Milan, Naples, and the Spanish Netherlands as compensation, the dream of a Habsburg Spain had died with her, a vision that could have been realized had she survived, had Joseph Ferdinand lived, had the inbred line somehow produced a miracle of health and longevity. Yet history rarely offers such mercy, and instead, it forced Europe into a series of wars, treaties, and negotiations that would shape the 18th century, demonstrating how the private suffering of a single princess could ripple outward, influencing diplomacy, military campaigns, and the fate of empires in ways she could never have imagined. And in recounting her life from the sickly child of Leopold I and Margaret Theresa, to the politically pawned bride of Maximilian II, to the mother of Joseph Ferdinand, one sees the brutal intersection of human genetics, imperial ambition, and the ruthless pragmatism of monarchy. A reminder that the greatest tragedies in history are often hidden behind the gilded walls of palaces and the polished speeches of diplomats, where lives are consumed not by choice, but by the inexorable demands of bloodlines, power, and legacy. And though Maria Antonia's story ended in death, the echoes of her life were felt across Europe, in the corridors of Versailles, Madrid, London, and Vienna, in the planning rooms of generals and the anxious whispers of courtiers, in every calculation of succession and treaty negotiation, for she represented the fragility and ambition of an entire dynasty, the human face of political strategy, and the inescapable consequences of centuries of inbreeding, obsession, and relentless dynastic calculation. And in remembering her story, one understands that history is rarely written by the will of the individual, but by the intersecting forces of blood, power, and fate, forces that Maria Antonia knew intimately, yet could not escape, forces that dictated every step of her life from cradle to grave. And as the War of the Spanish Succession unfolded, her absence was a silent witness to the ambitions she might have fulfilled, a cautionary tale of what happens when dynasties prioritize inheritance over humanity. And today, when we look back at her life, we see not just the tragedy of an inbred princess, not just the heartbreak of a mother lost too soon, but the sprawling consequences of a life that shaped wars, claims, and empires long after she was gone. And in that story, there is both fascination and warning. A lesson in how human ambition, when combined with flawed bloodlines, can create extraordinary history yet leave devastation in its wake. And as you reflect on Maria Antonia, the most inbred Habsburg of all time, her resilience, her suffering, and the cataclysmic consequences of her premature death, remember that every historical event, every war, every succession crisis has a human face, often tragic, often overlooked, and it is in these personal stories that we find the dark, intricate threads of history that shape the world we know today. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the most inbred Habsburg line and the tragic fate of Maria Antonia of Austria. If you enjoyed this detailed look at history, the dynasties, and the dark side of royal ambition, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Comment below your thoughts. Which part of Maria Antonia's story shocked you the most? And share this video with anyone who loves history's most fascinating tragedies. From all of us at Pastify Hub, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.